Wind came off the Kansas plain that October afternoon, with the smell of cured grass and something sharper underneath, something like heated iron. Hannah Voss stood at the edge of what her neighbors had already begun calling the widow's hole, and studied the sky the way her husband had taught her to study a horse before buying it. She was looking for the small tell, the thing most people missed. The clouds above her were thin and moving too fast for the season, and the grass at her boots leaned all one direction. As if the whole prairie were listening for something, the people on it had not yet heard. Behind her, her son Jonas, 12 years old and thin as a fence rail, dumped another bucket of clay-heavy dirt onto the growing pile. His sister Ruth, 9, sat cross-legged on a folded coat, sorting stones by size into 3 small mounds. The dog, an old brindle named Buck, lay near the pit, with his chin on his paws, one ear flicking every time the wind changed. The pit was 6 feet deep and 8 feet across. It had been dug into the south slope of the low rise where the sod house had stood before the fever spring, before the winter that took Ephraim, before the letter from the bank that arrived last April, with the polite, ruinous news that the loan on the upper quarter section had been called. Hannah had walked out of the bank in Abilene that day and stood on the boardwalk with the letter folded twice in her hand, and understood that she now had 140 acres, 3 cows, 7 hens, 2 children, a dog, and no house. The neighbors had offered opinions. The Ellsworth brothers, who farmed the section to the east, had suggested she sell the cows and move into town. The Reverend Coombs had suggested she remarry quickly and had a cousin in mind. Old Mrs. Prine, who had come out of Missouri, hollow 40 years earlier and outlived 3 husbands, had said nothing at all. She had walked around the burned foundation of the sod house, poked the ashes with her cane, looked at the south slope, and said, "You go down, girl. You go down into the ground, and you make the earth do the work the walls used to do." Then she had climbed back into her buckboard and driven away, and Hannah had stood a long time looking at the slope. That had been in June. It was now the middle of October, and the widow's hole was almost a kitchen. The men in the neighborhood laughed. That was the plain word for it. They had not laughed unkindly, most of them, but they had laughed. A kitchen underground, they said. A stove where the smoke has to climb up out of the earth like a gopher. A pantry where the mice would live better than the family. Silas Ellsworth had ridden by 3 times in September, and each time had stopped his horse at the fence line and shouted the same joke about whether she was planning to bake bread or bury it. His brother Amos had once dismounted and looked down into the pit and said, more quietly, "Hannah, a house belongs on the ground, not in it." He had meant it as a concern. She had thanked him and gone back to digging. She had her reasons. She kept them mostly to herself, because she had learned in the year since Ephraim died that a woman who explained herself out loud on the prairie was a woman inviting argument. But she had reasons. She had watched the sod house burn in April in under 20 minutes, because the roof timbers were bone dry and the grass on the roof caught from a spark out of the stovepipe. She had watched Ephraim cough his lungs out the previous winter, in a house whose walls sweated all night and froze by morning. She had watched their store of potatoes rot in a lean-to-root cellar that was not deep enough and not dry enough. She had lived 4 years in a house that was cold in winter, hot in summer, wet in spring, and made of the same dead grass that every prairie fire in the county lived to eat. She did not intend to live in another one. By the last week of October, the pit was finished. Jonas had helped her line the floor with a bed of river stones, hauled in 3 wagon loads from the creek 2 miles east. On top of the stones, they had laid a floor of packed clay mixed with straw, tamped down layer by layer until it was hard as a courthouse step. The walls of the pit had been shaved smooth and coated with the same clay and straw mix, 3 fingers thick, and then given a second coat of finer clay slurried with wood ash. When the coat dried, it turned the color of pale bone and rang faintly when Ruth tapped it with a spoon. The roof was where the neighbors had laughed the loudest. Hannah had cut cottonwood beams from the creek bottom, each one as thick as her thigh, and had laid them across the pit in 2 directions, a cross-hatched grid pinned at every joint with oak pegs Jonas had whittled through the long August evenings. On top of the beams, she had laid a floor of split cottonwood planks, and on top of the planks, she had laid a course of flat creek stones the size of dinner plates, fitted together like the scales of a fish. On top of the stones, she had laid 4 inches of clay. And on top of the clay, she had laid sod, not the thin, dry sod of the upland prairie. She had gone down into the low draws where the grass grew deep, and the roots ran a foot into black soil, and she had cut sod bricks so heavy Jonas could barely lift one end. She had laid them grass side down first, then grass side up on the second course, and she had watered them every evening for a week, until the roots knitted through the clay beneath, and the whole roof became one living thing. The neighbors, when they rode by now, saw only a low green mound on the south slope, no higher than a man's chest, with a stovepipe rising out of it and a plank door set into the downhill side. From the road it looked like a grave. Silas Ellsworth had said so, out loud, and had laughed. His laugh had carried on the wind, and Hannah, inside the finished kitchen, with her hands in bread dough, had heard it and had not looked up. Inside, the kitchen was 13 feet by 9. The stove was set against the north wall, with its pipe running straight up through a collar of fired clay that Hannah had shaped herself on a rainy afternoon in September. The pipe passed through the roof inside, a sleeve of tin, and around the sleeve, packed tight, was a double handful of dry wood ash and river sand, the old trick of a bohemian bricklayer she had once heard her father describe, meant to smother any spark that tried to climb the pipe and lodge in the roof grass. To the east of the stove, a low bench ran the length of the wall, and above it a shelf of split cedar held her flour tin, her salt crock, her sugar, her tea, and the small green bottle of vanilla that Ephraim had given her the Christmas before he died. The west wall was a pantry. Hannah had cut a second, smaller pit into the earth on that side, 4 feet deep and lined with the same clay, and had fitted a lid of pegged planks over it. Inside she had laid straw, and then, in careful rows, the crop of the summer. Potatoes in one bin, turnips in another, carrots buried in dry sand, onions braided and hanging from pegs, cabbages wrapped in newspaper, apples from the old Bergstrom orchard laid in single layers so they would not touch. A crock of salt pork sat in one corner. A crock of butter, salted heavy, sat in another. At the very back of the pantry, where the earth was coldest, she had set a stone jar of milk that would keep for 4 days without souring. Above the pantry lid, cut into the clay wall about a foot below the ceiling, was a small hole no wider than her wrist. It ran at a slight upward angle through the earth berm and opened outside on the north face of the mound, screened by a scrap of tin, punched full of holes to keep out the mice. On the opposite wall, near the floor, a matching hole ran outward and opened on the south face, low and shaded. Between the two holes, a slow, invisible river of air moved through the kitchen at all hours, cool air drawn in low from the shaded north, warm air rising and slipping out high on the sunlit south. Hannah had felt the draft with a candle flame on the first day the roof went on, and had watched the flame lean, and had known that the room would breathe. That was the other thing the neighbors did not know. Ruth was the first to give the kitchen its true name. She came in one afternoon in early November with her cheeks red from the wind, put her cold hands on the clay wall, and said, "Mama, the earth is warm." Hannah had smiled and said nothing, because she did not want to say too much, but she had noted the temperature that day herself. Outside, the wind was cutting. The thermometer nailed to the fence post read 32. Inside the kitchen, with no fire lit since morning, it was 58. The stove had been cold for 6 hours. The walls were still holding the heat of yesterday's baking like a hand that would not let go. She thought about that for a long time that night, sitting on the bench with Ruth asleep against her shoulder and Jonas reading by the lamp. She thought about how a stone left in the sun all day was still warm to the touch after dark. She thought about how the root cellar at her mother's farm in Ohio had always been the same temperature in July and January, cool in one and warm in the other, though nobody in the family had ever put a name to why. She thought about how 6 feet of earth over a roof was the same steady coolness that made the root cellar keep its potatoes and its milk. She thought about how the fire in the stove that morning had used only 3 sticks of cottonwood and had heated the room until Ruth complained. She did not have the word thermal mass. Nobody in that county did. But she had the thing itself, and she had begun to trust it. The trouble began in the second week of November. It came in the shape of Silas Ellsworth's oldest boy, Micah, who rode over on a borrowed mule to say that his father would like to buy her 3 cows before winter, at a fair price, since she would not be able to keep them through the cold in a house that was, as Silas had put it, half a hole. Hannah had thanked Micah, given him a piece of bread and a slice of cold ham, and sent him home with a polite refusal. She had watched him ride away and had understood that the offer was not really about the cows. The cows were the excuse. The offer was about the land. The upper quarter section she still owned bordered the Ellsworth place on two sides and held the only reliable spring within a mile. Silas had wanted it for 6 years. Ephraim had refused to sell. Now Ephraim was dead, the sod house was ashes, and Silas had decided, in the practical way of men who had waited long enough, that a widow living in a hole in the ground would sooner or later see reason. Hannah did not intend to see reason. She spent the next 3 weeks preparing for winter in a way that would have astonished Silas if he had ridden close enough to see. She dug a second, narrower pit, 15 feet from the kitchen door, and roofed it the same way, in miniature, and made it a stable for the 3 cows. It was not tall enough for them to stand fully upright at the peak, but it was tall enough at the walls, and the earth around it would hold the heat of their body of their boss through the coldest night the plains could throw. She banked the north wall of the kitchen with a fresh layer of sod cut from the low draws, laid 3 feet thick, and planted it with the last of the year's grass seed, so the roots would knit before the ground froze. She laid a windbreak of woven willow along the north side of the yard, 40 feet long, anchored to stakes driven 4 feet into the clay, and let the wind pile the first snows against it as a second wall. She also, in the last dry week of November, did the thing that would matter most, and that no one, not even Jonas, understood at the time. She cut a firebreak. She cut it wide, 20 feet on the north side, 40 feet on the west, 60 feet on the south. She walked behind the plow herself, with Jonas leading the mare, and she turned over every inch of grass in a wide arc around the mound until the earth showed black and bare on 3 sides, and the wind blew dust from it in small brown clouds. She did the east side last, and she made it the widest of all, because the wind in that country came almost always from the southwest. But when it came from the east in autumn, it came fast, and it came hot, and it came with fire. Silas rode by on the day she finished the east break. He sat his horse and looked at the black scar of turned earth around the green mound. He shook his head slowly, in the way a man shakes his head at a thing he has decided he no longer needs to understand. "Hannah," he said, "you have plowed 3 acres of grass. You cannot plant and cannot graze and cannot sell. You have plowed a ring around a hole. What in God's name are you fencing out?" She had leaned on the plow handles and wiped her forehead with the back of her wrist. "The prairie," she had said. He had ridden away laughing. She had gone back to the plow. The first snow came the 2nd week of December, and the kitchen passed its first test almost without her noticing. She woke up on a morning when the wind on the plain was 30 miles an hour, and the temperature outside was 4 degrees above zero. Inside, with no fire since 10 o'clock the night before, it was 41. She lit the stove with a single handful of kindling and 3 small sticks of cottonwood, and within 20 minutes the room was 60. Within an hour it was 70, and she had to crack the door. She began to keep a small record in the back of her Bible. It was not a diary, it was a ledger. Every morning she wrote the outside temperature, the inside temperature, and the amount of wood burned. By Christmas, she had a page full of numbers, and the numbers told a story she had not quite expected. On the coldest night of the month, when the wind chill on the plain would have killed a calf in the open, she had burned 4 pounds of wood. 4 pounds. Amos Ellsworth, she knew, was burning 40 pounds a night in his frame house, with the tar paper walls and the tin roof, because his wife had told her so at the December meeting in the schoolhouse. Half proud and half worried about the woodpile, Hannah did not tell anyone her numbers. She wrote them down. She watched them. She trusted them. January brought a stretch of weather that made even Amos Ellsworth quiet. For 9 days, the wind did not drop below 20 miles an hour, and the temperature did not rise above zero. On the 5th day, the Coombses lost a calf to the cold. On the 7th, Silas rode into town for more coal, and came back with a load that cost him $14, more than he had paid for coal in any month of his life. On the 8th day, a family of newcomers from Illinois abandoned their claim shanty 10 miles south and drove their wagon into town to sleep in the livery stable. On the 9th day, the wind finally shifted, and Hannah, standing outside her mound in the gray afternoon, saw the smoke from her own stovepipe rising thin and straight, and understood that she had burned less wood in 9 days than she had burned in a single week the previous winter. The kitchen was doing what Mrs. Prine had said the earth would do. It was doing the work the walls used to do. Spring came late and hard. The thaw brought water down from the upland in sheets, and half the sod houses in the county took water through their roofs. The Ellsworth barn lost a corner of its floor to a rat run that was filled with meltwater. The Coombs' root cellar flooded and drowned 2 months of pork. Hannah's mound, sitting on the south slope with its packed clay roof, pitched at a slight angle, and its channels of turned earth running away downhill on 3 sides, shed the water like the back of a duck. Inside the pantry, the potatoes were still firm in March. The apples were still whole in April. The onions were still hanging from their pegs, and only 2 had spoiled out of 40. By the time the grass came back in May, the neighborhood had stopped laughing. They had not, however, stopped watching. Silas came by in June to offer once more a fair price for the cows and a very fair price for the upper quarter. Hannah refused again. He rode away without laughing this time, and she understood that a quiet man is often more dangerous than a loud one. She said nothing to Jonas about it. She only spent the next month making the kitchen better. She dug a 3rd pit, deeper than the pantry and narrower, and set inside it a wooden box lined with tin, and packed the box with straw. Into the box, on the first cold morning of June, she put a slab of ice cut from the creek the previous winter and buried under 6 feet of sawdust in the shed at the north end of the yard. The ice held. Through July, through the hottest week of August, the ice held. Ruth was allowed, once a week, to chip a small piece off the corner and put it in the milk. She said the milk tasted like Christmas. Hannah dug a 4th pit that summer, small and away from the mound, and lined it with clay, and made of it a cistern that collected rainwater from a rough gutter she rigged along the low south face of the roof. The gutter was a hollowed cottonwood log split lengthwise and pegged to the roof edge. It fed a clay pipe she had shaped and fired herself in a rough kiln she and Jonas built out of stones from the creek. The pipe ran through the earth berm into the cistern, and the cistern, buried and cool, held 60 gallons of clean water at a temperature that never rose above 60 degrees even when the pump handle at the well was too hot to touch. By August, the kitchen was not only a kitchen. It was a system with a heart of stone floor and clay walls, lungs of quiet air moving between 2 small holes, a stomach of pantry and icebox and cistern, and a skin of grass 6 feet thick that held its temperature like a living thing. Hannah did not think of it in those words. She only knew. When she came in from the field in the burning afternoon and put her hand on the clay wall by the door, that the wall was cool. And when she came in from the pump in the frozen morning and put her hand on the same wall, the wall was warm. And she knew, though she could not have said why, that the earth was doing something the walls of a wooden house could never do. The autumn of the 2nd year came in dry. Everyone said so. The creek was low by August. The upper spring was down to a trickle by the 1st week of September, and the grass on the uplands was the color of old straw by the middle of the month. Hannah watched it and did not like what she saw. She rewalked her firebreaks in September and widened them by another 5 feet on every side. Silas rode by and shook his head. "You are plowing under good grass, Hannah," he said. "Grass that could feed a cow." She had looked at the sky, which had not held rain in 6 weeks, and had said, "The grass will feed something, Silas. I would rather it not be a fire." He had ridden on. He did not laugh this time, but he did not widen his own brakes either. The wind came up on the 8th of October. It came from the southwest at first, dry and steady, and then it swung around to the east in the middle of the afternoon and picked up speed until the loose dust on the yard rose in sheets, and the hens went into the coop of their own accord an hour before sunset. Hannah stood at the top of the mound and looked east, and she saw, low along the horizon, a color that was not a color of sky. It was the color of smoke. It was still far, but it was there. She sent Jonas for the cows. She sent Ruth for the water buckets and the wet sacks she had kept ready by the pump since the 1st week of September. She herself went to the stable pit and led the mare out, and tied her to the ring, set into the clay wall of the mound on the sheltered side, and then she went back into the kitchen and did the thing she had planned for 2 years and had never spoken aloud. She went down the roof. She climbed the low slope of the mound with the buckets, and she poured water across the sod until the grass was black and the clay beneath was dark with moisture, and the whole mound smelled like a riverbank in spring. She did it twice. She did it 3 times. She did it 4 times. Jonas came back with the cows and put them in the pit and closed the door, and then he climbed the mound with a bucket of his own and helped. Ruth wet the willow windbreak on the north side, dragging the wet sacks along the base until the willow shone. By 7 o'clock, the sky in the east was orange. By 8, it was red. By 9, the wind was screaming, and the air smelled of scorched grass and pine resin from 20 miles away, and Hannah could hear, faint and terrible under the wind, the sound she had heard once as a girl in Ohio, when a barn full of hay had caught in July. It was the sound of fire eating air. She brought the children into the kitchen. She shut the plank door and dropped the wooden bar. She wet a rolled blanket and laid it along the base of the door where the small gap was. She closed the small tin-screened vent on the north wall and half-closed the one on the south because she did not want the fire to breathe through her house. But she did not want the house to breathe nothing at all either. She lit no lamp. She and Jonas and Ruth sat on the bench along the east wall, and Buck the dog crawled under the bench and pressed his flank against Ruth's leg, and they listened. The fire came at 10. It came the way, she had been told as a child, that a fast train comes past a small station without stopping. It came with a sound like a great sheet of canvas being ripped by a giant. It came with a light that showed under the door in a hard orange line, and then, as it passed directly over the mound, in no line at all, because there was no gap left for the light to find. It came with a heat that made the clay wall behind Hannah's shoulders faintly warm to the touch. And no more, because 6 feet of wet earth and green sod and packed clay and river stone stood between her family and a wall of flame moving at 30 miles an hour. It came and it passed. It took 12 minutes to cross her property. She knew because she counted slowly, from the first roar of it at the east firebreak to the last hiss of it dying against the plowed strip on the west. In those 12 minutes, the prairie grass burned down to black stubble on all sides of her breaks. In those 12 minutes, the willow windbreak on the north side, wet and low and half buried in the earth berm, scorched but did not burn. In those 12 minutes, the roof of her mound, wet with 200 gallons of water and thick with living roots and packed with clay, smoldered along one edge for a moment, and then went out. In those 12 minutes, the door held, the vents held, the walls held, and the earth held. She waited a full hour after the sound had gone before she opened the door. When she opened it, the yard outside was not a yard. It was black. The willow was scorched to the top and would need to be cut back in spring, but was not dead at the root. The wet sacks she had dragged along the fence line were black rags. The plowed firebreaks were still bare and still holding exactly as she had cut them, and the fire had run past them on both sides and gone on west, toward the Ellsworth section. The stable pit had held. The cows were shaking but alive. The chickens in the coop, which she had moved that afternoon into the earth berm on the north side of the mound, were alive. She did not walk to the fence line until morning. When she did, she saw what she had suspected in the dark. On the far side of her firebreak, the prairie was black to the horizon. Where the Ellsworth house had stood the previous evening, there was a chimney and a stove and a heap of black timbers and nothing else. Where the Coombs place had stood, there was a black square. Where the newcomer family's claimed shanty had been, there was not even a chimney. Down along the section road, 3 wagons stood in the middle of the burn, where their owners had abandoned them and run for the creek. At noon, Silas Ellsworth walked, not rode, up her lane. His hat was gone. His coat was scorched along one sleeve. His face was the color of old ash. His wife and his oldest boy were with him, and the boy was carrying a bundle that Hannah realized, after a moment, was all that was left of a family of 5. She met them at the fence. She did not speak first. She had learned, in the year since Ephraim had died, that a woman who spoke first on the prairie was a woman inviting argument. She waited. Silas looked at the green mound behind her. He looked at the black plowed ring around it. He looked at the stovepipe, rising thin and straight from the sod. He looked at the willow, scorched but alive. He looked at the small pit stable where the cows were lowing, and at the small pit coop where the hens were beginning, tentatively, to scratch. He looked, last, at Hannah, and she saw a thing move across his face that she had never seen there before and could not at first name. It took her a long moment to understand that it was a shame. "Hannah," he said. His voice was hoarse from the smoke. "My wife and my boy have nowhere to sleep." She opened the gate. They came into the kitchen, all three of them, and Silas Ellsworth sat down on the bench along the east wall and put his face in his hands, and his wife sat beside him and did not speak, and their boy stood by the stove and looked at the clay walls and the packed floor and the ceiling of pegged cottonwood, and after a long minute he said, quietly, "Mom, it's warm in here." Hannah put the kettle on the stove. She said, "It has been warm in here all summer, Micah. That is why it is cool here now." She fed them. She fed them potatoes from the pantry, apples from the west bin, bread baked that morning, butter from the crock, milk from the stone jar at the back of the cool wall. She fed them tea from the shelf above the bench. She fed them, and then she made up a bed for the boy on the pantry side of the kitchen, and a bed for Silas and his wife along the west wall. And she and Jonas and Ruth slept in the loft above the stable pit, where the cows breathed slow through the night and warmed slow through the night until it was small space above them, until it was almost too warm to bear. In the morning she walked with Silas along the firebreaks, and showed him, without saying much, what she had done. She showed him where the plow had turned the earth and stopped the grass. She showed him where the wet sacks had lain along the fence. Nicholas. She showed him the small tin-screened vents that had let the kitchen breathe without letting the fire in. She showed him the packed clay collar around the stovepipe and the ring of ash and sand that surrounded it inside the roof. She showed him the pit stable and the pit coop and the buried cistern. She showed him the sawdust-covered ice shed, which had come through the fire untouched because it, too, was mostly underground. She did not lecture him. She only pointed. He nodded once at each thing. When they came back to the door of the kitchen, he stopped and put his hand flat against the clay wall by the door, and he stood there for a long time, and finally he said, "It is cool, Hannah." She said, "It has been cool in here all summer, Silas. That is why it is warm here in winter." He looked at her, and she saw the shame again, and something else with it now, something quieter and more useful. It was the look of a man who had decided to learn. By the end of that month, the Ellsworths were digging. Silas cut into the south slope of his own rise, and hauled clay and river stone and cottonwood beams, and Hannah walked over 3 times a week to show him what she had done and why. She showed him the 2 vents at opposite corners and opposite heights, so the room would breathe cool from the shaded side and let warm air rise out of the sunlit side. She showed him the double course of sod on the roof, laid grass to grass so the roots would grow together. She showed him the packed clay collar around on the stovepipe, so no spark could climb the pipe and lodge in the dry grass above. She showed him the plowed rings, wider than any man would think reasonable, that had, on the 8th of October, been the only reason her family had a house to sleep in that night. By the following spring, there were 4 new mounds on the low rises within a mile of Hannah's place. By the following autumn, there were 7. By the year after that, when the drought came back, and the fire came again, and this time swept the whole eastern half of the county, only the mounds and the plowed rings around them stood in the black landscape like green islands. The people who had built them lived. The people who had not, mostly, did not. Hannah did not become famous. She did not want to be. She lived in the mound for the rest of her life, and she raised her 2 children in it, and Jonas grew up and built his own mound on the upper quarter section, next to the spring. And Ruth grew up and married a schoolteacher and moved to Abilene, but came home every Christmas and slept, on the coldest nights, along the west wall, with her hand against the clay, because she said it was the only wall she had ever known that felt alive. Mrs. Prine, the old woman from the Missouri Hollow, came by one afternoon in the second spring after the fire. She walked around Hannah's mound in silence, poked the sod roof with her cane, looked at the plowed rings, looked at the stovepipe, looked at the pit stable and the pit coop and the buried cistern and the sawdust ice shed. She stood for a while at the top of the mound with the wind moving her white hair, and finally she came down the slope and stood in front of Hannah and said, "You went down." "I went down," Hannah said. Mrs. Prine nodded. She said, "The earth is patient, girl. Men forget things. The earth does not." She got back into her buckboard and drove away, and Hannah stood at the fence and watched her go and thought about how the earth held heat in the winter and cold in the summer, and how the same 6 feet of soil that made a grave in one story made a home in another, and how everything her neighbors had laughed at, from the pit to the plowed ring, from the vents to the sod, from the ice shed to the buried cistern, had been part of a single quiet idea that she had not put into words for herself, but that Mrs. Prine had, that first afternoon on the burned foundation. You make the earth do the work the walls used to do. The prairie is a hard country. It is hard in the summer, when the sun beats down on the grass, and the wind carries the heat like a hand pressed to the face. It is hard in the winter, when the same wind carries the cold like a knife. It is hard in the spring, when the water comes down off the uplands and finds every seam in every wall and every crack in every floor. It is hardest in the autumn, when the grass is cured and the wind swings around to the east, and the fire finds a spark somewhere and remembers what it is. Against a country like that, a potent howl is a brave thing but a temporary thing. Against a country like that, a sod house is a stubborn thing but a fragile thing. Against a country like that, the only thing that lasts, in the long run, is the country itself. The earth, the clay, the stone, the living root. Hannah Voss understood that in the summer of her 32nd year, standing on the burned foundation of her husband's house, with a bank letter folded twice in her hand and 2 children, and the cows and a dog and no walls. She understood it as a pyramid is supposed to. She understood it because an old woman told her, and she understood it because she had watched a sod house burn in 20 minutes, and a husband coughed his lungs out through walls that sweated all night and froze by morning. She understood it, and she did what almost nobody in her county was willing to do. She stopped fighting the earth. She joined it. She went down. She dug 6 feet into the south slope of a low rise, and she lined the pit with river stone and packed clay, and she roofed it with cottonwood beams and creek stone and living sod. She cut 2 small vents at opposite corners so the room would breathe. She built a pantry into the west wall and an ice shed under the sawdust north of the yard and a cistern under the south side of the roof. She plowed a black ring around all of it wider than any man thought reasonable. And she trusted, when the fire came, that the earth would do the work the walls used to do. It did. 12 minutes of flame passed over her family that October night in 1874, and when it had gone, the widow's kitchen was the only building standing between the creek and the county road. Not because Hannah was lucky. Not because the wind shifted at the last moment, though people would later say it had. Not because God, as the Reverend Coombs suggested from the pulpit the following Sunday, had spared her in reward for her patience. It stood because the ground held the heat, and shed the cold, and shed the water, and shed the fire, and because a woman had listened, one afternoon on a burned foundation, to an old woman with a cane who had come out of a Missouri hollow 40 years earlier, and had said, quietly and without laughing, "You go down, girl. You go down into the ground, and you make the earth do the work the walls used to do." The mound is not there anymore. The sod fell in during the drought of the 1930s, and the beams rotted, and the clay walls slumped, and the plowed rings grew back into grass, and the county road was straightened in 1952 so that it no longer passed the low rise on the south slope. If you walk that section today, in the tall grass in October, when the wind comes down off the plain with the smell of cured hay and something sharper underneath, you will not see a mound. You will see only a slight dip in the ground and a scatter of river stone in the grass. And, if you know where to look, the faint dark ring of turned earth that a plow made 150 years ago, it around a green island in a black country. But the idea is still there. The idea is in every root cellar dug into a hillside in Missouri, every earth-sheltered home built into a slope in Nebraska, every green roof laid over a barn in Vermont, every plowed firebreak cut around a homestead in Kansas in a dry October. The idea is in the quiet knowledge, held mostly by old people now, and mostly forgotten by everyone else, that the ground beneath a person's feet is not an enemy to be walled off, but a partner to be listened to. That 6 feet of earth over a roof is 6 feet of steady coolness in July, and 6 feet of steady warmth in January. That a fire moves fast on the surface and not at all beneath it. That the wind cannot cut what it cannot find. That the earth is patient, and men forget things, and the earth does not. Hannah Voss lived to be 81. She died in the mound she had dug in 1874, in the bed along the west wall, on a morning in early spring when the clay was warm to the touch, and the first grass was coming up green over the roof above her. Ruth was with her. Jonas was with her. Buck the dog was long gone, but a granddaughter's dog lay on the packed clay floor by the stove. The kettle was on. The pantry, on the west wall, still held potatoes and apples and onions, and a stone jar of milk at the back of the cool wall, the cool wall that had been cool every day of every year for 47 years. Her last words, according to Ruth, were not about her husband, or her children, or her land, or her God. They were about the wall. She put her hand flat against the clay by the bed, the way she had done 10,000 times before, and she said quietly, to no one in particular, "It is warm." Then she closed her eyes, and the earth, which had done the work the walls used to do for almost half a century, did the last work as well. It held her. It has held her since, and somewhere, in a small ledger tucked into the back of a family Bible in a farmhouse in Abilene, there are still pages of numbers in a careful hand. Outside temperature, inside temperature, wood burned, water collected, ice remaining, potatoes firm, apples whole, onions hanging, milk sweet, page after page of quiet evidence that a widow on the Kansas plain in the winter of 1874, without a word of science and without a dollar of help, had figured out, alone, in the dark, with 2 children and a dog and a burned foundation and an old woman's advice, one of the oldest and most forgotten truths in the long history of human shelter. The best wall is not a wall. The best wall is the earth. And the neighbors who laughed at the widow's underground kitchen on a bright afternoon in the summer of 1874, and who came, hats in hand, to sit on her bench and drink her tea and sleep against her clay walls on the black morning after the Prairie fire, learned it in 12 minutes of flame and remembered it. Most of them. For the rest of their lives. The rest of us are only now beginning to remember it again.